Welcome to the video. In this video we're going to take a look at this ready to fly quadcopter here. Now, one of the things that happens a lot on the channel is we get lots of requests for subscribers asking us to have a look at specific models, either kits, ready to fly, bind and fly or whatever. This happens to be one that's come from gearbest.com, so I need to say a thank you to those guys. But what I thought it was a perfect opportunity to do was actually to go through the things that I look at when I'm looking at a model to get for review, and the things that I consider to try and figure out whether or not it's even worth our time getting it in here to have a play with. So what I'm going to do in this video is, unlike a normal review, we're actually going to go through each of these points, and the idea is then if you find a model somewhere that you're interested in potentially getting, you can follow through these points and kind of do the homework and ask the right questions, so when you do order it there's a better chance of it, 1, working, 2, working well, and 3, working the way that you want it to. So very quickly, let me show you what comes in the package. So the way this thing arrives is actually comes in a really nice bag. In the bag is the radio, which I think is an actual FlySky i6, but it's been rebadged as Idea Fly, which everything seems to be in here. We also have a set of both 3 and 2 bladed props, and we have the model itself. We also have the battery and even have a little charger with it as well. So you get pretty much everything in here that you need to fly, and the radio is set up and it's already bound and configured. So all you need to do in theory is charge the batteries, fit the props, and you should be good to go. You can see that it is about 344 grams, not including the battery. It's an FS-IA6 receiver, which we'll have a look at in a minute, which is a pretty standard receiver that we've used here on the channel with all kinds of FlySky radios. This one is not one we've used a lot, to be fair. It tends to be the FlySky i6S and variants. It comes with a 4S battery, so that is already telling me that this is designed to be a little bit quick. We can see that the motors are 2205 2300 kV, which is pretty standard for this size of model, and that the ESCs are 30 amp ESCs with a burst ability for 40 amps. So that is all telling me that this is kind of set up to be a little bit of a speed machine. Now, some of the specifications here on GearBest I think are a little bit enthusiastic when it comes to top speed, because what we're looking at here, a lot of the components on this model are exactly the same as lots of other models that are around there, which is exactly why it's worthwhile us just taking a step back and talking about what I normally look at when I start to consider a model for review. So here's the things that I tend to think about. Let's just move those out of the way. So this is obviously a little bit of a different model. It's designed to look like a grasshopper, but the electronics and everything in here are pretty standard. The flight controller is a clone of the Seriously Pro board. The ESCs are pretty standard. The motors are 2205 2300 kV, which we've used tons and tons. There's some nice touches. It's got some FPV equipment. The connector on the back for the FPV equipment, sadly, is the type with a pin in the middle, which I know for some is fine, but others isn't great. LEDs at the back, and then you have a little camera in the front for FPV. I think it's a little 700 TVL line camera. It's a no name, no brand, but I'm sure it'll work fine in bright conditions. The eyes light up, and you can see the radio receiver there. Those are all the wires that connect up to the PWM connection. So the things that I tend to look at on a model like this are: what flight controller is it, making sure that it isn't an older one, what software is it running by default. A lot of these models used to come with Clean Flight, now they're starting to come with things like Beta Flight. What motors and props, hence what battery is it that you need. The props and ESCs and everything on here seem sized reasonably well, but we'll talk about that. We've looked at it when we've been building quadcopters on the channel, but again, it's a good thing to check. The majority of things I look at these days, it's very rare that I find somebody that's undersizing speed controllers now. It used to be a problem back in the early days, but now everybody seems to have got the hang of making sure that the spec of the kit is right, but it pays to check. We'll look at the FPV camera and the video quality, what radio it is, if there's one included, Ideally, you want a radio that's going to last for the model, but also potentially allow you to bind other things to it as well. The challenge that you have whenever you're buying a model that comes with things like radios and battery chargers is the radios and things that are supplied are value for money pieces. So, you know, this isn't going to replace something like a high-end Taranis, a DX18, a Futaba radio, but it's absolutely enough to get you flying with the model that you're buying. Now, the flight controller in here, if we look at the specs, says it's an F310 DOF. Looking at the board, it looks like a Seriously Pro clone, which is fine. F3 means that it's got a reasonably modern processor, and it'll be able to run all the latest versions of things like CleanFlight and Betaflight. So that is a tick in the box. We also need to see whether it's the basic or advanced version. The one on this, it says it's a 10 DOF board. If you're not sure what DOF's all around, we have a video on the channel where we talk about what all the DOF means. But the 2-second version is, if it says 10 DOF, it's the advanced version of the board that has a barometer and a magnetometer. If it's something like 6 DOF, then it hasn't got those 2 extra pieces. Now, those 2 extra pieces are useful if you want to try things like iNav and GPS navigation later on, and things like Betaflight turn them off by default, but having them there is handy, and it also shows that the supplier isn't cutting corners with the flight controller that they're using. Do make sure that it's easy to get the USB cable in and out. This one is great. The USB cable's at the side, so it's going to be a piece of cake for us to plug it into the computer and see how it's all configured, or potentially change settings, tunings, modes, or even update the entire board. Some of the models that we've seen here, amazingly, have that tucked away in the middle, and you're snookered unless you want to start taking the model to pieces. Things like that are just signs of somebody that's thought about it. Now, the flight controller in here isn't listed on the specifications for the model, so it's tricky to know which one you're dealing with. I'm just assuming it's a Seriously Pro because that's what most of the clone boards right now are, and I recognise the port here around the USB. Now, we can plug that into a PC and check that that's the case. If it's a board that looks slightly different, or if it lists the kind of board that it's going to be using, do have a look and do your reviews. Make sure it's a flight controller that's working. Also look at the reviews of the actual model that you're considering as well, in case the flight controller is a problem for some pilots. The majority of the boards that are in these things these days, particularly at these kind of price points, are going to be clone versions of the original board. Now, that always means that they are built to a price, potentially in the same factory that was originally building the boards for the primary manufacturer, in this case, which is Seriously Pro. That's Dominic Clifton and those guys. So if you're ever using a board like this that's a clone, I'd still bung him a couple of bucks just to thank him for making a board that's so good that everyone seems to be ripping it off. Last thing to have a look at is whether or not it's wired for things like VBAT monitoring. Now, for things like an on-screen display, then what you tend to find is those kind of extra things are handy if you have the VBAT stuff configured and wired up. Now here, unfortunately, I can't tell, so we're going to have to plug it into Try, and some of the listings aren't clear. So if it isn't clear, don't feel shy about asking the vendor how it's all configured and what kind of functions it's got. Next one to talk about then is the software. Now, the software is typically going to be CleanFlight. More often it's starting to become Betaflight. Now, the way this kind of works when people ask me the difference is Betaflight is the one that at the moment is changing quicker. All the new code is kind of going in there. The frantic pace of updates means that some of the time that's been spent in things like CleanFlight on code cleanup and management isn't managing to make it across into Betaflight. So they're two slightly different ways of approaching it, but most pilots these days are starting to turn to Betaflight because it's got all the new funky flight code in it. You will almost certainly at some point have to plug your model into a computer. I know for some of you that is the last thing you want to do, and why you want to buy a model like this that comes pre-configured, but in all of the reviews that we tend to do, we tend to plug it in and have a look at the modes that are there by default, make sure that the accelerometers are calibrated, and do some testing before we take it out to the field. You are putting a lot of faith in whoever put this together and programmed it and bound the radio, that they did everything right, but it's you that's going to pay the price if it takes off and flips backwards and hits you in the face. So do make sure that if it's going to be running CleanFlight or Betaflight, and again, if it isn't in the listing, ask the vendor, and make sure that you can download those things in Chrome on your PC and they work okay. That'll save you potentially getting a model and then finding that you can't talk to it to set it up or check how it's configured when it arrives. Next thing to talk about, motors and props. Now, the motor choice used to be a lot more than it is now, and the motor choice for the majority of bind and flies or these kind of ready to fly models are these 2205 2300s. Now, these are branded as Fly Sky. Hopefully the camera's picking that up. It's got nice directional bits on. There are lots of different motor types out there. We fly loads of VMAX, DYS we use a lot. We also use Tiger motors, Foxeer. The motors these days are all reasonably pretty good. The thing to do is, if the model is using a motor that hasn't got a name on it like that, it's again a bit trickier to do your research, but I would always try and fire up Google, have a look and do a search to find out what people think of the motors that are on the model and whether they're going to be up to spec. The way it kind of works here is a 2300 kV 2205 motor is going to be good for most things, and it will give you fantastic performance. Things like 2400s or 2600s will give you far more performance, but typically give you far shorter flight times. Do make sure that the ESCs are BL heli so you can flash them and change things. I always used to use Simon K, but I'm getting more and more into the BL heli way of thinking now. It gives you more options if you need to change things and you start having a problem. But last thing I say is, do make sure if you can see the components that they're listed separately and they're using other vendors' components, just do a quick Google search and make sure that they're happy. The FPV kit on this, it's a 700 TVL PAL camera at the front. Nice, it's PAL for us here in Europe. So there it is at the front, all mounted nicely. It's nice and recessed within this slightly wacky head that they have on this model, so it'll provide a reasonable image. Here's some footage of what it looks like out and about, and it's doing a reasonable job. We also have the FPV transmitter here at the back. The FPV transmitter will typically come with a really dodgy aerial. Try and find out what antenna comes in the pack. If it's one of the whip aerials that just looks like a black little finger that you stick in the end, they are nigh on useless, so you'll have to get yourself a little mushroom antenna or a circular polarized antenna that'll fit the kind of connection that you've got. Other nice kind of features here for the video transmitter is whether or not the power is adjustable. If you want to fly with friends or at an event, most event organisers, unless you're running 25 milliwatts, won't even let you fly, and typically outside a lot of people will run 200 milliwatts, so check the legal limit in your country, and it's nice if you get a video transmitter on the model that allows you to change that power. Last couple of things then, do check online when you're looking at the model, search on the website that you're looking at buying it from that they have spares. Crashing is absolutely part of the hobby. Now this model here has a one-piece base plate. It's about 3.5 millimeters of appears to be carbon fibre. Tricky without actually putting a hole through it, say whether it's carbon fibre all the way through. But the challenge of a bottom plate like this is if you manage to have a hard landing and you snap one of the arms, then you're going to have to take off the entire bottom plate, all the motors, and refit everything back onto a new bottom plate. Do think about that when you're ordering a model. Have a look at what it looks like, because I like models, particularly for new pilots, that have separate arms. Just allows you to swap them out when you have one of those nasty tumbles. The other thing I quite like is when they have separate boards for pieces. That again makes it easy to replace stuff if you have a problem. So if the flight controller gives up, or the power distribution board fails, or the video transmitter gives up the ghost because you crash and the aerial snaps off, those kind of things can be easier to fix if they're separate little components. Some models have all of these components on one massive PCB. Things like the Nighthawk were like that, and that's great, but the challenge with that is if you manage to completely destroy an ESC, then you're replacing an entire expensive board rather than individual components like we have on here. Radio, battery and charger. So the radio that comes with this is one of these. The really nice thing, it's actually already set up for the model, so it's already bound and it's ready to rock and roll, which is great. The thing I'd reiterate here is that these models, I mean, this is the FlySky i6. This is one of the first ones we've had actually. We tend to play with the FlySky i6S, which is the slightly newer brother of this. This is absolutely fine for me. The gimbals aren't brilliant. They don't feel fantastic. As a new pilot, you probably won't know because you won't have tried anything else, but once you have flown for a little while, you'll find that you'll start to outgrow radios like this, and you'll end up using them for kind of presence or backup drones that you might take to somewhere for a friend or a family member to fly. So do think about that. This is a great way, a kit like this, to get all the pieces that you need, but you will very quickly particularly start to outgrow things like the charger, which will be quite basic, and the radio as well. So although this is a great place to start, once you start getting into the hobby and you want to get other models, either have a look at models that will bind to the radio that you've already got, or decide to bite the bullet, invest in a really nice radio, and then start to set up all the models on that new radio. Things like the Taranis are a popular choice at the moment. And then final considerations. Think about the vendor that you're buying it from. Have a look online. Have a look at what the feedback and experience has been for the supply of the product. Think about what happens if it arrives damaged and what support is available. If you take this thing out of the box, you plug it in and nothing happens. A lot of suppliers out there are jumping onto the quadcopter bandwagon, and you can get these things from pretty much anywhere now in thousands and thousands and different connotations. If you're a new pilot, then do have a think about that. Places like this channel exist to provide free support, but it is free. It's there for when I get time to answer questions, but the person that you ordered the product from should be the person that's there to help you through any problems you might have and help get you flying if you're getting a bit stuck. The other thing that's very hard to see when you're looking at the Spectra model is how good is the tune. Now, tuning is something that's very personal, and the default tuning on something like Betaflight will get you closer to where you need to be than maybe CleanFlight will. For a new pilot, you'll probably not be able to notice the difference too much, but for pilots with a little bit of time under their belt, they'll start to notice when things aren't behaving properly and want to change things up. Now, a lot of models that are coming these days are trying to get that tune a little bit closer to what the pilots will need, but just be aware of that. Again, have a look at the reviews online, have a look at what the write-ups are saying about the model, and see whether or not the tune is default or not. If it already has been tuned, that's one less thing that you have to think about in the first 3 or 4 months with the model. Last couple of things on safety before we finish the video. First of all, last thing you do is install the props. All the testing, making sure that you can arm and run the motors, all that goodness, you make sure you do without the props on the model. That's the very, very last thing. The other thing to think about here is that you never power up the model without the FPV antenna installed. If you do, you'll potentially cook the transmission electronics in the FPV transmitter. So hopefully that helps those of you that are looking for something like this. In summary, this is a good basic model. It will fly well. It's got the electronics on that I would kind of look for and expect. It's a slightly goofy looking thing with the whole idea of looking like a grasshopper. That isn't particularly my cup of tea, but I think some people find that quite whimsical. You could easily take off that front piece and make a little camera mount and take this bit off the back. With a little bit of re-engineering, you could probably make this into quite a sleek little quadcopter. So thanks again to GearBest for supplying this to take a look at, and hopefully now if you look at something that you're considering buying, you've got some things to think about. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and happy flying.